last week or 2 weeks ago, I wanted to be able to actually do introductions and get to know you a little bit better. And I was worried that I wasn't going to have enough content, but then I ended up kind of not being able to get through all of it. So I would like going forward for things to be more interactive. I promise I'm not going to lecture at you all the time. I'd like to be in conversation as much as possible. And one thing that I would also really like to do is every week I'd like to try and kind of leave you with a tangible kind of offering that you can utilize. So I had mentioned this book, Working the Roots. And another thing going forward, I do apologize. I've been kind of busy. I do teach at two universities, and right now we're kind of at the very end of the semester. So I'm grading for 130 to 150 students. And so I've been meaning to actually send out the text just so you have all of the readings that I'm using. And I'll try to do that ahead of time in the future just so you have them. And there's no obligation for you to read them. But if you wanted to have those resources, this is one that I really would like to provide. Working through the roots and kind of go through this stuff. It gives some history about particular spiritual traditions and the ways that because of slavery and bringing some of these traditions into the United States, they've kind of shifted. And we see in some cases that kind of cultural exchange that we talked about last time, where we see all of these different elements of different cultures, in this case, different spiritual traditions being kind of blended together. So we'll kind of talk about some of those histories. And then there's also really great resources on natural medicine, focusing on preventative health, focusing on particular ailments and remedies, focusing on, I think there's animal health in here, obviously human health in here. So it gets into all kinds of different things, talking about water divining, other forms of divination. So I thought that that would be kind of a fun resource to share. And talking about conjuring, hoodoo remedies, that kind of thing. So I thought that that would be kind of fun. And we were talking about cultural appropriation last time. And so I just wanted to talk about really quickly, and that's kind of, I guess, going to be a big part of the conversation, but it's a very complicated conversation when it comes to cultural appropriation. The main elements of cultural appropriation usually involve some type of a benefit to the person who is appropriating. And usually with appropriating, we're taking an element from a particular culture in such a way where we're decontextualizing it. So if I'm taking something from a particular spiritual tradition and kind of passing that off as my own idea, for example, or claiming to be an expert on that kind of knowledge of those particular spiritual traditions, that would be kind of problematic, especially when there's some type of social benefit or financial benefit or reward. So I wanted to talk about and introduce two concepts. One of them is praxis, and one of them is self-reflexivity. So with self-reflexivity, all that means is we're kind of examining our own ideas, behaviors, value systems, belief systems, and trying to unpack the ways that we may be reinforcing oppressive thoughts, ideas, actions, that kind of thing. And just trying to be mindful of causing the least amount of harm possible. So kind of always checking in with ourselves. So even though and I know you folks have had a lot of conversations about cultural appropriation and being very mindful in your practices. But because of the society that we've all been kind of socialized into, it's always a matter of coming and checking back in, because it's so easy. It's second nature to kind of fall back into those old patterns, old value systems, belief systems, thoughts, and things like that. So that's really important. And then praxis is another one. So we're not only kind of talking about, we're talking about history, we're talking about theory, and we're not only kind of learning about these things, but how do you kind of incorporate this into the ways you understand yourself, the ways you understand your relationships with other people, with the land, with animals, your role in community, that kind of thing, your relationship to, again, oppressive forms of violence, that kind of thing. So it's all about trying to embody in particular ways the stuff that you're learning. And obviously not everything is going to be for everyone. And not everything is meant to be taken, but we have to be kind of mindful and to take care of how we're kind of engaging with these traditions, with the understanding that we can still engage with them, we can still learn from them. And especially with the conversation for today, I think there's a lot that can be taken and embodied just based on the nature of African spiritualities, and the ways that it's kind of this interconnected relationship with all aspects of our lives being important. I think that's something that we can kind of take with us in our own practices as well. And that's kind of the framework for how I want to be in conversation and do introductions today. Is just kind of being a bit reflective. And that's kind of the way that I like to process. But what I'd like to do first is get into the notes. So we had left off at those videos down towards the bottom. It was after we were talking about Anansi and the ways that that God was being represented in that show American Gods, and the ways that we kind of assign this Western lens for viewing and understanding African spiritualities. So one of the things that's going to be really central to these conversations is, you know, over time, these spiritual traditions have been altered in particular ways. They've been, you know,
that's not
eradicated in particular ways. So I'm sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought. I think if I'm not mistaken, I might be able to do a screen share.
Yeah, you can screen share. I don't know why it's not letting me scroll. And I don't know why. That's so weird. Here, yeah, you try. One sec. Okay. Let me stop sharing. And I think, yeah, okay, cool. Awesome.
Okay. So the reason that I'm using the word spiritualities and not religion, and I may have spoken to this last time, but the term religion implies a separation from other aspects of our lives, our culture, society, or environment. Whereas, as I kind of mentioned already, with spirituality, it's being woven through all aspects of our lives, our everyday lives. So we're connecting it to culture, society, the environment, again, our relationships with one another, our relationships with ourselves. The ways that we kind of move in community and the ways we move in public spaces, those types of things. Ethnic identity becomes really important. Where one's family comes from becomes an important part of identification. One thing that I would like to talk about, especially if there's interest, is, you know, our understandings of gender and sexuality are Western, right? Gender and sexuality are Western constructs, or they're social constructs. We've created these categories for organizing people in our society and kind of assigning particular meanings to them. And before European colonization in Africa, we had what we would understand to be queer folks in regards to gender identity and expression, in regards to sexuality. Again, but without kind of having those concepts that they kind of subscribe to. But those were the folks in the communities in many cases who were the healers in the communities, who were the kind of spiritual practitioners in the communities that folks went to for healing, for advice, that kind of thing. So we'll probably do a little bit of the history here and there and kind of unpack that stuff. I personally think it's interesting and important. And again, that's another way of thinking about our identities, our relationships, in the context of, again, those spiritual identities before colonization. Those were some of the, I don't want to say the most important members of society, but they played a major role as far as their contributions to the community, and that being really central to their identities, right? Doing that kind of emotional labor on behalf of communities. So being able to kind of have those conversations, I think, is really important. So we might spend some time just talking about that as well. So this informs everything, you know, these spiritual traditions inform everything in societies, from art to marriage, health, diet, dress, economics, and death. So again, it's really every aspect of our lives. There's a saying that comes out of the women's movement here in the US in the 1960s, 70s, and it's that the personal is political. And that means that even the aspects of our lives that we perceive to be private, so things that happen in the home, things that within our interpersonal relationships, all of these things are political. All of these things are a part of those larger structures. So we have to be able to analyze and examine all of these components of our lives and recognize the significance of all of these components of our lives and really engage with them intentionally. So I just wanted to share this quote because I think it's important to talking about again that the multiplicities, the holistic nature of African spiritualities. So this is actually common in many different indigenous traditions, including outside of African spiritual traditions. This idea that sickness is not only an imbalance in the body, but in one's social life. It can be related to emotion, that kind of thing. And that can lead to a breakdown in community networks, family networks, and relationships to one's ancestors. And so this relationship with ancestors is going to be really important because, again, because we're talking about the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, that created a bulk of the dispersion of different African peoples out of Africa and into other parts of the world. There was that disconnect that exists, that severing of our connections to our ancestors, those cultural traditions, the spiritual traditions. And in the spiritual tradition, that can become a form of the kind of sickness that takes place in the body, a kind of spiritual wound, essentially. And this actually really relates to the work that I do personally. The work that I do focuses on the ways that trauma and different types of trauma impact the body. And so if you folks are interested, um, I would love to share resources on that as well. I think that that work is really important. But that's just, again, a way that we're kind of connecting all of these different elements of our lives together in particular ways. The reason that we emphasize this connection and not kind of moving towards separation is when we use and engage in our spiritual relationships and identities in a way that we're creating those kind of divisions or disconnects from other aspects of our lives, that creates an opportunity for us to kind of avoid accountability for the ways that we might be using our spiritualities to cause harm or weaponizing our spiritualities against other people. So I don't know if you folks have heard the term spiritual bypassing, for example, but that would be a really good one that really gets at the ways that we can use our spirituality in ways that fall into what's called toxic positivity in many cases. So rather than engaging with particular issues, we're using particular spiritual ideas, beliefs, and toxic positivity, just for those of you who might not be familiar, what that is kind of getting at is, you know, the good vibes only type situation, right? We only want to engage with the positive. We only want to engage with positive energy. And maybe you folks are familiar with the idea that, you know, to engage with what you perceive to be, and we have to think about, you know, how are we perceiving what is negative energy, what is positive energy. So, you know, creating and assigning our own definitions of negative energy, not engaging in particular ways with, again, ways that we might be causing harm. Maybe we have been called in about exploiting particular practices that are unique to particular indigenous spiritual traditions, such as the use of burning sage, for example. And that's something that we'll talk about that comes from indigenous folks here, but also, again, that kind of culmination of Christianity, the indigenous spiritual traditions, and the African spiritual traditions that were being brought over, especially Yoruba. So just wanting to be really mindful of how we're thinking about these types of relationships and the complexities, layers, the interconnected nature of the relationships. I have a feeling that I wanted to say more about this, and I'll probably come back to this idea in a little bit. So as I mentioned before, with the African diaspora, again, a bulk of that migration out of the continent was due to the slave trade that started in the 15th century, and that has contributed to actually, especially in the context of Yoruba, causing those African spiritual traditions to kind of spread across the world. So including the United States, including Europe. We're going to put emphasis on the Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean traditions. A lot of them are listed here. Like in Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Puerto Rico, where slavery was happening. And therefore, we see, again, in particular ways, a different, based on the indigenous populations, based on those enslaved African populations, and the particular European groups who enslaved them. And so in many cases, we're thinking about the context of Christianity. And that's why, for example, When you see folks who are engaging in, tarot readings or things like that, maybe they have cards where they're pulling and engaging with Christian figures. Sometimes they'll be engaging with figures from Santeria. Sometimes they'll be pulling from the Lukumi tradition, and you'll kind of see this meshing together of different, kind of pulling from different spiritual and religious traditions and kind of meshing them together. So that's a big part of why that happens. And so we'll kind of look at all of those different layers, what some of this stuff looked like before, what these kind of that cultural exchange looks like, where these groups are kind of coming together and adopting elements of one another's cultures. And then we'll also look at this kind of reclamation of traditional connections, as I mentioned before, for members of the African diaspora who have been kind of separated and severed from their ancestral knowledges and legacies. There are folks who are trying to kind of reconnect to those traditions in particular ways. And that, there's no kind of definitive way to do that, just because keep in mind, if you're familiar with the, ancestry DNA test, for example, I think I already said this last time, but the way that it works is, let's say it comes up, 15% Nigerian, 30% Ethiopian. All that means is that you have a 15% chance that you have ancestors who are from Nigeria and a 30% chance that you have ancestors from Ethiopia. So that's kind of how you read it, right? But it doesn't necessarily give you definitive answers about where your ancestors have come from. And ethnicity and race are, again, socially constructed. They're not biological. So you can kind of pinpoint particular regions. Thinking about how adaptation, I won't go into that at all, but just thinking about how that works. But we don't really have a way to really genuinely connect back. So you might see folks who might be kind of going to Western Africa, especially Ghana, as a way of trying to kind of reconnect to those traditions to the best of their ability. And understanding the significance, right, on a spiritual level of what it means to kind of address that severing and kind of come back together with members of our communities, right? Thinking about the African diaspora as this kind of collective, this larger community, obviously made up of different groups, still wanting to acknowledge differences, but recognizing the shared histories. So these are just some of the traditions that have been kind of spread around the world. I mentioned Yoruba and Santeria. Santeria you're probably already familiar with. I mentioned the Lukumi tradition last time we spoke. I gave that example. And this was just to contextualize again that we don't want to impose our Western interpretations onto these traditions and practices, but within the Lukumi tradition, going back into the tide, throwing yourself into the water is seen as healing. And as I said, within the Western context or the Western lens, they would say, well, that's just, a cultural a story or a folklore, that kind of thing. But they would see it as invalid. Whereas Western science actually says the same thing, just through different language. So understanding that there's a different cultural language here, right? It's cultural, it's spiritual. And so just because we have different systems that we might be operating from, it doesn't necessarily make these systems invalid. There's no kind of one correct. And so we don't want to reinforce this binary of there's one kind of correct cultural or spiritual perspective and all others are incorrect. And as I mentioned before, I'm sure you folks are familiar with many practitioners who engage with many different spiritual traditions rather than kind of just engaging with one. And that, again, can be appropriate. I see many people who do that, who are very invested in educating themselves about the traditions. And when they're doing that kind of work, really sharing that knowledge as well. And that becomes really important, right? Not really claiming that as their own, but sharing the origins, the roots of these traditions, and educating others about them so that they can kind of engage in a way that is mindful and respectful. And there are some particular elements of African spiritualities, those traditions, that are seeing a revival on the continent as well. So that's another kind of part of the conversation. And that's a little bit separate from those folks who are kind of coming back to the continent after being separated for generations. But within that context of folks in Africa who are trying to kind of revive that, those particular traditions, because they're still on the land and because they're still connected geographically, that becomes really important to being able to kind of have access to those ancestral knowledge traditions, if that makes sense. Separating folks from the land, separating people from, with slavery, separating folks out from members of their own ethnic groups and communities who speak the same languages, who came from the same spiritual traditions and so on, was really important as a way of trying to eradicate these cultures, eradicate these spiritual practices. So the fact that we still see particular ideas and practices alive on the continent makes a lot of sense, because they still have been connected to the land. In particular spiritual traditions, there is this belief that there's knowledge that's held in the land, and part of what that means is we're using the land as a way of forming knowledge, as a way of, we kind of read the land in particular ways, right? As a way of collecting knowledge as well. So knowledge sits in places is essentially this idea that I'm speaking to. And we use the land as a way of passing down particular knowledge traditions. So I kind of talked last time about how for these healers in the communities, we have folks who are engaging in African spiritual traditions, who are seeking out healing, who might be seeking out medicine. And healing, again, can be a physical sense. It can be in a spiritual sense. In some cases, we may, again, be looking at the interconnected relationships between spiritual hurt and spiritual harm and physical repercussions of that. I talked about the charms and the amulets and things that were used in the communities to offer good luck, as a way of offering protection, as a way of trying to keep plantation owners or slave owners from being able to cause physical harm, or having charms that would allow for insurrections or rebellions to be successful in the context of slavery. So we'll kind of be getting into that more deeply as well. And you folks are probably familiar with some of this stuff. And again, I have some of this stuff. You're all probably familiar with Florida water, for example, that being kind of newer compared to some of the stuff that would have been used looking back during the context of slavery and before then. One thing that I like to say about that, though, so we're using charms, we're using amulets, but what becomes important is, again, I kind of talked about how we start to commodify or turn spirituality into a product that can be sold. So you're buying all of the crystals and gems, and you're buying all of the cards and things like that. It's all about purchasing, and you need to have particular items in order to do this thing. For example, particular deities, as we'll talk about when we look at the Orishas, particular deities would like to receive particular types of offerings, right? So if you don't have those oranges and the honey and things, well, Oshun's not going to come. Well, that's not necessarily how it works, right? For our ancestors, in many cases, especially in the context of those who were enslaved and kind of stripped away from their ancestral lands, they were using what they could get their hands on. It was all about survival. And that's why this book is really important, because for these folks, they had no knowledge of the land. And that's why they were enslaved, right? Because they didn't have ways to escape. They didn't have ways to navigate the land, but they figured it out, and they built relationships with the land and learned about particular herbs and particular roots and things, and what the benefits of using them were on the body, looking at it again in a spiritual context, and making those types of connections to where these items are kind of being used in the context of good luck, and feeling like this would be something that could incur good luck in the context of rebellion and freedom, right? Liberation. So I wanted to just say a little bit more about what I was talking about last time, with the ways that we're coming in with different cultural contexts, different lenses for understanding these types of things. So I wanted to just give an example. I like to talk about our relationships with children. So this is a Maasai greeting. How are the children? And this is very different. And I mentioned last time, and let me just pull it up for folks who weren't able to see it. I think I may have actually went past it. Let's see. Yep. Okay. So I mentioned that we will be talking about, and this is a specific Sankofa that we talked about last time, but we'll be having conversations about these particular kind of spiritual beliefs, spiritual, kind of like guiding principles. I'm trying to think of a better word here. What's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me. But sometimes we have particular like a motto or something that's like a guiding principle that we kind of use to guide our own practices, our relationships, again, the ways that we kind of navigate the world around us. So we will kind of come back in and talk about these a bit more. But one of them that was important is this idea that, how are the children, how are the more vulnerable members of our communities, elderly folks, as I mentioned before, children, animals, the land, those who we kind of, and again, gender becoming important again, but we have these types of paternalistic types of relationships with those who are vulnerable, where we kind of assume that we need to engage a particular level of control over, right, and domination over these types of groups, these groups of people. So this becoming a spiritual guiding principle versus in the United States being separated from these legacies, from these spiritual traditions, and having different types of relationships with children, where our relationships with children, especially again, thinking about Black Americans, right, Black families, needing to teach children how to be safe in the context of police violence, in the context of vigilante violence, racially motivated hate crimes and things like that, and having very different relationships and kind of losing these particular kind of guiding principles in our lives. So what we end up doing in our communities is in our relationships with children, the idea is I'm going to prepare you for the world. And I'm sure you folks have heard of this and maybe you've experienced it in other different types of contexts, right? As this one's specific to the threat of violence against Black children. But this idea that I have to toughen you up, I have to harden you to prepare you for the world, right? We've become out of touch from our own systems, our own cultural systems and practices. And that becomes a way that we kind of create our relationships with children. A paternalistic type of care, what happens is we're dehumanizing them. We don't recognize them as having knowledge and being knowledgeable about their own emotions, their own experiences, their own needs. Children are very insightful, I personally believe. And so we're kind of invalidating all of that knowledge, all of the perspective that they bring. What ends up happening is we don't see them as accurate translators of their own experiences. So again, maybe this might be familiar for some of you folks, but growing up in households where maybe you don't get to have a voice, you don't get to speak up, the authority figure and their perspective and their kind of rule and what they say goes. So this is again going back into gender. It's a very kind of gendered type of relationship, right? Where we treat those who are seen as the more vulnerable members of our communities as more feminine. And then we become more masculine. As I said before, this is very different from looking at these indigenous societies that we're going to be talking about, where in many cases, these were matriarchal societies. A patriarchy is about power imbalances and having power over women and women's bodies, and femme and non-binary folks and other folks we kind of mark as feminine, regardless of how they identify. Very different though with matriarchies, right? Matriarchies are not rooted in power dynamics, power imbalances. It was all about for those members who were again kind of the healers in the community, who were the ones kind of the spiritual advisors, the ones giving the roots and the herbs and the trinkets and things for protection, that kind of thing. They were the ones who were the purveyors of cultural knowledge. They were the ones who were creating particular systems and relationships with the land, particular agricultural systems. So very different kind of dynamic than what we have. So part of that kind of remembering and reclaiming our traditions is reclaiming those types of relationships with our more vulnerable communities. And again, that bringing in that interconnected nature of these spiritual identities and relationships, right? It should be woven into every aspect of our lives. So with the matriarchy, for example, it's going to be communal. We're going to look at our communal responsibilities to one another. I recognize that I'm a member of a community. I have a responsibility to serve members of my community. In the context of COVID, right, I have a responsibility to be mindful of public health and my responsibility and all of that, following what the protocols are, whether that be social distancing, wearing a mask. If getting vaccinated and understanding the new protocols in place with vaccination, or if I'm not vaccinated, understanding those protocols, but being mindful of my relationship to other people, right? I am never only merely impacted as an individual, right? The idea of individualism has been kind of brought over and enforced where it didn't used to exist. So again, with the context of COVID, right? Well, but I want to do this. I want to go to this place. And it's more about how it's going to impact me as an individual. This goes back into the spiritual as well, right? We can't disconnect it. Think about, for example, and I kind of want to give an applied example. I've known people in the past. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about my spiritual identity as we get into introductions. But part of the challenge for me, so I transitioned from religious to spiritual, so from Christian, religious specifically coming from a Christian household, to being more spiritual, and my spiritual relationship is kind of personal to me. And as I was engaging with other folks who are also spiritual and coming from various different spiritual traditions, I was seeing a lot of individualism in their spiritual practices rather than this communal approach. So part of that might look like, I believe that I can engage in ritual, I can engage in spell casting and things like that for the sake of my own personal benefit, right? Some self-interest or self-serving means, rather than thinking about, again, community, for example, thinking about the land, thinking about things like that, or even if it is something that benefits me, is it benefiting me in a way where it's going to impact other lives as well? That kind of thing, right? Is it rooted in community, or is it kind of more so about kind of self-interest? For example, in the context of religion, we would see it as ludicrous for someone to kind of pray and say, hey, dear God, I really, really want a Corvette, please, thanks. But I don't have to work for it, right? I put the prayer out there. I did the spell, I did the ritual, and that's it. That's all I have to do, right? Within these traditions, we understand that you don't only put out your, when you want to manifest things, right? You don't merely put out your intention. You have to put out your intention, but you have to work on it as well, right? You have to put in the labor. Papa Legba, for example, for those of you who might be familiar, the crossroads god, right? You're supposed to give an offering, and when you make your ask, when you ask for a particular thing to manifest, you have to make a promise, right? A guarantee of your contribution. So it's never this kind of one-sided thing. I'm not just merely asking for something and receiving, right? That's not enough. I'm not this kind of divine being. I have a responsibility to community. I have a responsibility to serve as well. And it's a way of thinking about it this way and practicing it in this way, hopefully will help us to get away from creating particular types of kind of hierarchies, right? These ranking and ordering structures where all of a sudden we see ourselves as enlightened in a particular type of way where in some cases we feel more deserving of particular things. We feel like divine beings in ways where we see ourselves as superior to other people. That shouldn't be the purpose, and that shouldn't be the point, right? That shouldn't be how we're practicing spiritually. It's all about how am I going to think about my relationship to community. So I mentioned last time, we watched a couple videos. Marie Laveau was one of them. And Marie Laveau actually played a major role in her community. And she served her community in the context of slavery. She was, if I'm not mistaken, the daughter of a Frenchman. So her father was white. Her father was someone who benefited from slavery. And that did give her a level of economic power, social power, political power. And she actually uses her and engages through her spiritual practice and uses her position of power as a way of supporting and helping those enslaved people. And this is, again, a part of that legacy of conjurers or healers in the community being really relied on in the context of enslaved folks who are either trying to rebel, overthrow and abolish the system of slavery, that kind of thing. We may actually have time today to look at this video for context.
There's something to be said about the city of New Orleans, the city that so profoundly captures both the old world and the new in its never-ending nightlife, its renowned cuisine, and the celebration of the diverse African, French, and American culture. Indeed, it seems like the sort of place where if magic could take place, it would be here, in the Big Easy. Of course, this brings me to one of New Orleans' most notable residents, Marie Laveau, who the woman said to be the Voodoo Queen. Despite having been dead for over 200 years now, people still say that Marie Laveau has power over the city. Going by what the legends say about her voodoo practices, Laveau would perform remarkable feats, some saying they are nothing short of miracles. In this video, we'll primarily be focusing on Louisiana voodoo, or New Orleans voodoo, which is the product of the religion Voodoo, though heavily influenced by the Christian and French culture of New Orleans, in which Marie Laveau would become a staple of. Although there is plenty of information about Marie Laveau in the legends and lore of New Orleans, separating the fact from myth isn't exactly easy. We know little of Laveau's early life, other than that she was likely born in 1801 to a wealthy plantation owner, as some sources say, and his black mistress. Her father, who is also cited as being Charles Laveau, may also have been something of a politician, going on to become a mayor of New Orleans in 1812. Her mother was named Marguerite, and was also said to be something of a voodoo practitioner. We also know that Laveau would go on to marry a man named Jacques Paris, a carpenter who would give her 2 children. However, Paris would suddenly go missing in 1824, whereby Laveau would speak of his death, claiming to be a widow. Though it's equally believable that Paris had simply deserted Laveau, but that she was too prideful to admit this. After all, she was described as being a beautiful woman, tall with dark curly hair and golden skin. At the pinnacle of her notoriety, tabloids would describe her as having good features. Good features at the time, meaning that she appeared to have the physical traits of a white woman more than a black one. After Paris's death, Marie would begin working in a beauty parlor as a hairdresser. This is actually one of the most important parts of her life, but here she would service the wealthy white and Creole women of New Orleans, whereby they would confide in her their most intimate secrets, desires, information about their husbands, lovers, their estates, and family affairs. Many believe that this wealth of information that Laveau would receive on a daily basis is what gave her political leverage, and is the reason why she was able to rise up through the social ranks. Laveau would later begin a relationship with a man named Louis Christophe de Glapion, a man from a powerful local family, whom she would birth 15 children to in rapid succession. It would lead her to quit hairdressing and devote her time to raising her brood. It's here she began to take interest in her mother's voodoo practices and traditional African beliefs. Voodoo had a sinister reputation for itself in Louisiana, and was even banned at several points. Many believed it was the art of the devil, and that it was here to usurp Christianity, turning Christians and good folk onto a darker path filled with mystics and magics. Of course, many who held this view were not entirely familiar with voodoo and traditional African beliefs, and were likely to embellish the practice to serve their own agenda, citing it as evil, corrupt, or otherwise blasphemous. But this didn't stop Laveau and many other clientele from practicing voodoo. In fact, Laveau herself would learn most of her craft from a voodoo doctor in New Orleans, who was simply and rather insidiously known as Dr. John. What separates Louisiana voodoo from Voodoo and other forms of voodoo is the Catholic influence that people like Laveau infused with it. Louisiana voodoo would incorporate holy water, incense, statues of saints, and even consisted of Christian prayers, thus making it more acceptable to the upper class and more appealing to those who were devout to Christianity. A lot of Laveau's beliefs included spiritual forces, as is common in all voodoo, whereby the spirits which are summoned can be either benign or mischievous. The idea was that these spirits connected with the followers of voodoo, guiding them, imparting some form of divine knowledge, or simply bringing good vibes. How this was achieved was through a mixture of dance, music, singing, and even the use of snakes. In fact, Laveau herself was even said to have worn a pet snake around her neck, which was named Zombie. Some of Marie's notable services as the Voodoo Queen include the selling of gree-gree bags, an amulet originating from Africa that is said to bring fortune and protect the wearer from evil. The gree-gree bags were said to contain a variety of ingredients that were blessed by voodoo queens or voodoo doctors to bring the wearer a certain effect or destiny. Charms, magical powders, ailments, and desire-granting ornaments, including those that could destroy a customer's enemies, were also sold by Laveau. She would also conduct spiritual readings, telling fortunes, giving advice to those who sought it, and casting spells including cures, charms, or even curses for the right price. However, some historians believe that Laveau's feared powers were actually just clever acts, and that all of her divine knowledge about people's lives was merely acquired by the recording of many secrets that were spilled to her by her clients. Bearing in mind, she would be serving many prominent households in New Orleans, some of them likely to divulge certain sensitive information, given her warm and compassionate persona. It suggested that Laveau would use this information to further her own status, or would use this information to build the idea that she was indeed all-knowledgeable. Another account has it that Laveau would use the black servants of rich whites to obtain information, and that she would do this by either instilling fear into the servants, threatening to curse or hex them, or simply pay them off. There is one story of Laveau's powers that would captivate all of New Orleans. Supposedly, a wealthy man's son was accused of a rape allegation and was set to face a long jail sentence. The evidence against the wealthy man's son was damning, and it looked to be an open and shut case. Desperate to ensure his son's freedom, and out of all options to achieve it, the wealthy man went to Laveau for aid. In exchange for her success in this matter, he would offer her a house. Laveau agreed and hosted a voodoo ritual where she underwent a form of self-torture. She placed 3 ridiculously hot guinea peppers in her mouth and held them there for hours as she appeased to the spirits. In voodoo, the belief is that the spirits take pity on those under great suffering, and so Laveau would use her pain to draw the spirits out and grant her what she sought.
We use a guinea pepper, hotter than Hades. When the gods see this willingness to suffer, to sacrifice, they pay attention.
On the day of the hearing, Laveau snuck into the courthouse and placed the guinea peppers that had been in her mouth under the seat of the judge. Some believe that the energy from the spiritually enhanced peppers caused the judge to set the wealthy man's son free. As was the agreement, the wealthy man would then grant Laveau the house he had promised her. However, some historians dispute this case, stating that if such an occurrence did in fact take place, then it's likely that Laveau would have known the judge through her social circles, or would at least known something incriminating about the judge for which she would have used to blackmail him with. Of course, she would have still used her voodoo theatrics to convince New Orleans that she did indeed possess magical powers, but some believe that the basis of her powers was merely political manipulation and intimidation. When Laveau passed away in 1881, she was said to have died with a smile on her face. Reporters of the time referred to her not as a sinister practitioner of dark magic, but as the kindest woman who ever lived, a saintly figure who nursed the sick and spread compassion amongst the diseased and the condemned. Laveau is buried in St. Louis Cemetery, in the Laveau-Glapion family crypt. The burials are in vaults above ground, where Laveau's tomb attracts many visitors, even to this day. Many slabs in the area, including Laveau's own tomb, are marked by visitors with an X symbol. The idea stems from a decades-old rumor that Laveau would grant wishes from beyond the grave if an X was marked on her tomb. Supposedly, the ritual goes something along the lines of marking an X on the tomb, turning around 3 times, knocking on the tomb, and then yelling out your wish. Should the wish come true, then the wisher would need to come back, circle the X so others would know of Laveau's power, and then leave the voodoo queen an offering. One of Laveau's daughters, also named Marie Laveau, was said to carry on her mother's mantle after her death. By some accounts, she was the splitting image of her mother, though what she had in looks, she lacked in her mother's spirit. Some have said that she did not possess the warmth and compassion of her mother, and was more inclined to inspire fear. One of her most notable talents was the ability to fulfill the desire of any man. She would hold lavish parties at Maison Blanche, a building for the congregation of blacks and whites in New Orleans, where women would dance naked for men, politicians, and high officials. Essentially, this building, amongst others, would become something of a brothel, but it was never raided by the police, who feared that if they intervened, Marie Laveau II would curse them. Some would say that Marie Laveau II drowned in a lake after a big storm. Ever since then, both Laveaus have sunk into obscurity. Marie Laveau continues to be a central figure of Louisiana voodoo, however, and of New Orleans culture. It's said that gamblers even shout her name when throwing dice or before big stakes. Additionally, there have been multiple tales of sightings of the Voodoo Queen, even to this day. And that wraps up the tale of Marie Laveau. But was she a powerful Voodoo Queen, capable of cures and curses and contacting spirits? Or was she more of a political player, using a network of spies and her own cunning to enhance and embellish her abilities? You tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button. Our next occult legend comes from Jewish history, whereby a rabbi created a creature to protect other Jews, only to have it turn bloodthirsty and violent. Until the next time, guys.
So there are a couple of things that I wanted to talk about really quickly that came up in the video. One thing, we had engaged with Marie Laveau in the context of the way she was represented in American Horror Story. And we talked about the ways, and I don't think I named this, but they are reinforcing these negative portrayals of voodoo as being black magic, as being just rooted in, again, thinking about the emphasis on torture, pain, thinking about it as being more kind of malevolent and evil, meant to cause harm, those types of things. So Papa Legba, also known as Elegua, was also portrayed in the show, and the same type of thing is happening where we're seeing them as engaging in black magic. What actually ends up happening, as I mentioned before, is that the way that the processes work, and as I mentioned in the video, even with going to the grave of Marie Laveau, you have to follow a particular type of process, right? You have to put in a level of work. You have to put in a level of, obviously you have your intention, but you also have to follow that up with some type of an action. And usually the actions are very specific. So of course, in the example of Marie Laveau, there was a very specific type of process. They mentioned gris-gris, and I will have to show you some, and maybe one of these days, maybe we can kind of do more of a hands-on thing and talk about like how it's made. But with a gris-gris, for example, and having that kind of a good luck charm, and they come, it can be for good luck, it can be for attracting love, good fortune, protection, those types of things. But there's a process where the gris-gris, you see it as a living thing that you have to feed, you have to care for it, you have to treat it as like a living entity. There's always a process and there's always a level of labor that you have to put in order to receive something out, right? And it's no different from any other aspect of our lives. And I want to be careful about that. I want to be careful not to reinforce what's called the myth of meritocracy. So I'm not saying, if you put in the work, that means you're going to get it, right? It's complicated. And I'm sure you folks are familiar with the idea. Some people do believe, if it's not in alignment with your higher good, what's in your best interest, whether it's something you want but maybe don't need, then it might not be meant to happen, right? And it may not manifest anyway. So you still have to put the labor in, but also, again, the intention becomes important. Why do I want this? Why do I feel like I need this? Is it in my higher good, my interest? Is it in the interest of the community? There was a question that came up last time that we kind of engaged with, where in the context of slavery, even for enslaved conjurers, there was this fear, and the fear that gave them kind of power over other members of the community, and fear that gave them power over people who are actually in a position of power over them. So slave owners, plantation owners, being afraid of conjurers in the community because of the fear of their power or their perceived power. As I mentioned, Marie Laveau did come from a background where she did have access to, especially, in the case, in the context of slavery, for her to have that kind of access to power is not common. Usually what would happen was you would take on, in the context of Black folks, that would take on the status of their mother. And so usually, and she was a product of interracial sexual violence. Usually what would happen is these white male slave owners would sexually assault enslaved Black women, and then the children would then become enslaved as well. And the purpose it served was to create this larger labor force. So her case was unique. It's not to say that it didn't happen, but opportunities to kind of buy your way out of slavery or to be free through your lineage were a lot less common in the United States than other countries like Brazil, for example, where slavery actually began. So having the knowledge and the power is important to keep in mind. We talked about Frederick Douglass and the ways that even though he himself, he really was more indoctrinated into Christianity, and keeping in mind that Christianity was kind of being positioned in direct contrast to these types of spiritual traditions. And in this context, thinking about Vodun and thinking about Hoodoo, for example. And even though he personally, because he was Christian, he did not believe in these spiritual traditions, but even still, he still would engage with, taking particular trinkets for protection. He would still engage in particular processes anyway. So it becomes kind of complicated, right? Even though he didn't have that kind of investment, and he didn't kind of see it as valid or legitimate, there was still this sense of power in it. There's still a sense of significance in these spiritual traditions that I think is really important. And on the other side of things, for plantation owners who enslaved and exploited Black people for their labor, there was a fear of unfamiliar spiritualities, and this is very common in the context of colonization. As I mentioned earlier, having these unfamiliar spiritualities, these spiritual traditions were seen as evil, the same ways we're kind of stereotyping as Black magic. It's evil, it's malevolent, it's rooted in wanting to cause harm. And specifically where these ideas come from is there was fear that they were going to pose a threat in the context of this kind of colonial mission, right, to build this new society on stolen Native land with enslaved Black people. So that's a bulk of where the fear was coming from, and where, as we talked about last time we met up, where we see this kind of push to harm or punish individuals who are participating in their own spiritual, traditional indigenous African spiritual traditions, and then being forced into Christian doctrine in order to kind of alleviate what they perceived as a threat. And this was actually a really common practice. It didn't only happen with enslaved Africans, it also happened with Native Americans as well. And if you folks are interested, I can always share information and resources on that too. But very common and rooted in wanting to eradicate these spiritual traditions and eradicate these different groups' cultural identities as a way of trying to build and create this new society and to create an empire, right, where we're taking more land, taking more resources, and exercising control over it. So again, that individualism, getting away from interconnected relationship. So it's all connected, and we have to kind of think about in the context of those larger power structures. So one thing that I wanted to do, and I wanted to share one more story, because it was Earth Day when we were getting together last time. Earth Day had just passed, and so I wanted to give another connection. We don't, in these traditions, because of the interconnected nature, we don't engage in this break between human and nature like we do in the West, right? We are very disconnected from the land. We don't have relationships with the land in many cases because of the ways we've developed that paternalistic relationship I was talking about, where we see ourselves as, again, that kind of masculine entity that is here to kind of penetrate the land, right? We talk about the land as if it's feminine, and it's there to be penetrated, right? Penetrated for resources in the context of colonization, right? Turning those resources into products to be sold. So that's why we're kind of breaking from those spiritual traditions. Well, within our, again, more interconnected relationships, we're not engaging that split. We're reconnecting with the land. And as I talked about, part of what that means is understanding our ecosystems, participating in particular ways, right? Making contributions to those ecosystems and the health of the ecosystems in particular ways. And one thing that I mentioned is we want to be careful with this idea that women are naturally more spiritual. That is, again, rooted in colonization as well. And I could talk about that more if you folks are interested in getting into the kind of gender dynamics of things. But we want to also get away from that kind of gendered stereotype as well, right? We all can be or have the capacity to be spiritual, but just because we are women or femme, that doesn't mean that we may be. Just because, for indigenous, with indigenous traditions, we tend to see them as being in closer proximity to the land and therefore more spiritual, in the context especially of being able to be exploited for their spiritual knowledge. Think about in films where usually it's a white protagonist, especially a white male protagonist, and they are in a particular community engaging with indigenous people, and they go to that shaman or they go to that, I'm trying to think of what the name of the stereotype is when it comes to Black people. But there's always this kind of a spiritual advisor character in these indigenous communities that's there to serve the purpose of advising that white man, and in the context of conquest, right? Helping him conquer the land in some type of way, gain knowledge, gain access, gain control and power over the land in some type of way. So we want to kind of get away from those ideas that particular people are more spiritual because of the ways that we see them as being connected to nature. So just recognizing that people's relationships, spiritual relationships, are really complex. One thing, a story that I wanted to tell in the context of this conversation would be Wangari Maathai. She has a really great, she had a really great book where it's an autobiography, and she's talking about how when she was born in Nairobi, Kenya, she, what they do is they kind of chew up the first meal that was seen as kind of like the sacred meal of the land, the traditional meal of the land, like yams and goat meat or something along those lines. And then they kind of like spit that into the mouth of the baby, and that becomes a way of kind of welcoming them into the society, into the community, and introducing them to the community and the land, right? Because this is the food that's grown on the land. These are the animals who are living off of this land, right? Living off of the plant life. So it becomes a way of connecting them to the land. But over the course of her life, she was recognizing the role of deforestation and the ways that all of a sudden this practice was being lost. This being able to share this kind of sacred traditional meal was being lost. And so she ends up, and she had a particular background in the natural sciences that gave her more insight, but she ended up recognizing the significance of planting trees as a way of protecting and restoring the health of the ecosystem, because she recognized that with deforestation, all of a sudden plant life wasn't growing. All of a sudden, then obviously animals were also leaving those areas or dying off because they did not have food. So it was all interconnected, right? In order to have this sacred meal, we have to recognize that the ecosystem, our land, what we need as far as taking care of that land. So growing more trees, improving the soil quality, improving the ecosystem, allowing that kind of life to return back to that area. And so that's merely one example that I wanted to kind of cover, but I think it's really important. And I really, really recommend the book. She really gets into that more deeply and just really gets more into her background. So it's a really great book, and I do recommend it. But that just being one example of the ways that we're kind of engaging in a way that's interconnected, right? We're bringing our spirituality into every aspect of our lives and the work that we do, the ways that we are interacting with society, with the world around us. So I wanted to be able to do introductions if we can, since we didn't have a chance to do that last time. And we have about a half hour left. One other thing is I did have one video we didn't have a chance to watch. So if we do have time, we can do that as well. But I would love to do introductions if you folks wouldn't mind. And I can share information actually as well about some resources on trauma. I actually was putting a list together anyway, so I can send that to Alex to share with everyone. But I can also just flash a couple books that are really great as far as talking about the connections between trauma and the body. So I want to, if you don't mind, go to those questions that I was kind of posing in the Facebook chat. And the reason I wanted to kind of go to these questions is because I feel like it's really connected to this conversation of how are we engaging in a holistic way. So if you don't mind, what I was thinking about doing, and always feel free to jump in and just let me know if you kind of feel like maybe you'd like to do things in a different way. You know, at the end of the day, this is your class. And I think that your interests, the direction you want to take things is really important. So don't ever hesitate to let me know if you kind of want to do things in a particular type of way. But I was thinking we would just kind of go like question by question. And if we need some time to kind of sit with it before we kind of get together and process each question, that's fine. And then I can kind of grab some of those books I was mentioning. But if we can do that, that would be great. And then one thing before we get into these questions that I didn't put in there is I just wanted to ask if folks happen to have particular interests within, because African spiritualities is such a big kind of umbrella category. So if you had any specific interests and things you really wanted to get more deeply into, I would love to kind of be able to make space for that and really get more deeply into particular traditions that you might be interested in, particular concepts you might be interested in. So don't ever hesitate to let me know if there's kind of particular topics within this realm that you want to talk about, since it's such a big and expansive topic. So I'd like to just open it up really quickly and ask if you do have anything that off the top of your head that you would like to cover over the course of the next 15 weeks. And if not today, no worries. Do feel free to sit with that, and always feel free to let me know if something comes up, because we can always get into particular things more deeply. And Alex will send the notes over, and then you can kind of look at those different traditions as well. And if any of those are kind of calling out to you, we can get more into that. And when we do get into those, we will actually get into it in a more hands-on way. I know I'm doing a lot of history and like theory right now, but we'll actually get into, here's a gree-gree. Here's how you make it. This is here are the purposes that they can serve. Here are the processes, and here's what the relationship looks like. So I'd like to actually get into it more deeply in a way that's more interactive. So we will definitely do that going forward. And as many items as I can kind of bring in, I will do as well. I wish I had access to more, but as much as I can bring in, I will. So if there are any particular topics within this larger kind of expansive topic that you'd like to cover, do let me know. Otherwise, if you don't mind, what I'll go ahead and do is I'll pull up the questions. And if you just want to sit with the questions for a minute, I'm going to be jotting down some ideas as well, and I can kind of kick off the questions and things like that. But we can kind of go piece by piece and just do some introductions and get to know each other a little bit better. And I can also just send these in the chat so you have a way of viewing them. Oops. And I can just give like 10 minutes, if that's okay, to kind of process the questions and take notes, and then I'll grab those books that I was mentioning as well. So I actually put together a reading list that I was working on for my students just to give them a feel for the kinds of texts that I use in the work that I do. So this list is incomplete, but this is a lot of the books that I use in my work to kind of guide, again, the ways that I navigate kind of every aspect of my life, the way that I work in my profession as an educator, the way that I'm in, or ways that I'm in relationships with other people, the ways that I kind of move throughout society and that kind of thing. So there are some that are specific to the impacts of trauma and really explaining the science behind how trauma impacts your body. And if you're interested in learning more information, there's what's called epigenetics. And that's the study of the ways that trauma actually changes our genetic makeup and gives some context as to the ways that we can kind of pass down trauma through our DNA. So this book, Activate Your Vagus Nerve, by Dr. Devaz Habib, is a really great text that talks about a lot of the science behind how both of those parts of your nervous system get dysregulated. So you're all probably familiar with the fight, flight, freeze, where, whether your body is actually in danger or not, even if your body kind of perceives danger, you go into that fight, flight, freeze mode. And what happens is when you stay in that mode, your body is stressed, it's producing cortisol, and that leads to all kinds of different ailments, diseases, injuries, that kind of thing. Versus, and that's overworked versus your rest and digest phase, which helps to calm your body down. It helps, regulate your nervous system. It helps to, in the context of that inflammation. So that fight, flight, freeze causes a lot of inflammation in the body, and that's where we get into those health issues. Whereas with the rest and digest, we're decreasing the inflammation in the body. So it talks about the science behind how all of that works, but it also starts getting into here's how you regulate your vagus nerve. And you can actually do a quick search. There are some articles that are very brief, kind of one page that kind of says, here are some things you can do to activate your vagus nerve. And it's all about focusing on the body and bringing the body into the work. So I have other books that talk about the impacts of, I particularly like to talk about childhood trauma. So these are books that talk about the impacts of childhood trauma on the body, and then healing justice as well. That would be kind of the overarching framework for doing this work. Some of them a little bit more specific to working on the body and in the body. And one of those is the one that I mentioned that I'd actually like to share with you all. So I can actually send you that resource, but I can send this list to you all so you have a copy of it. And in some cases, I actually do have some PDFs of some of these books. So if you would need access, I can share access to those PDFs as well. So I'll send that list over. And let me just make a note so I don't forget. And one of the books I do have a PDF of is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So it talks about, it's the same conversation, but in the context of slavery and the ways that slavery has impacted Black people. Physically, mentally, emotionally. So that's just one of them, but I'll try to add on that list the documents, the ones that I actually have PDFs of. Okay, so do you all feel ready to kind of do the introductions? Do you feel like you had enough time to process? Okay, I can go first just to get things going. And I kind of said a little bit already, but in the context of how I identify myself spiritually right now, I feel like I'm in a complicated place. I think I kind of mentioned this before. I came from a religious background, and it wasn't, it's a Christian household. It wasn't super strict or super, conservative or anything like that. We didn't go to church all the time, but those ideas were there. The fear was there, the fear that kind of keeps you rooted in, trying to engage in the practices. Well, I need to be Christian, right? Or else I'm going to go to hell. Something bad's going to happen to me. So let me go ahead and try and, how do I want to frame this? Like, let me try and invest in doing this work. Let me try and be a good Christian. I feel like I'm obligated to do that. Let me give it a shot. And so I did that, and I ended up accidentally, and I will say I'm kind of a doormat type, or I have been a doormat type, where it was always really hard for me to say no. So I ended up, when I was in college, getting asked to do Bible study by this group that was actually a cult. Grace Church, if you're familiar. I think they're rooted in Utah. And yeah, they're very exploitative economically. What they do is they kind of exploit college students. They bring them into the church, and then they kind of have them take on particular jobs and things like that. So anyway, I ended up in those spaces, and our beliefs were out of alignment. They believed in things that I personally didn't. For example, there are particular forms of Christianity where they believe that everyone can speak in tongues, right? Once you build that relationship and make that connection, then you have all of these different types of kind of abilities that you develop. And if you don't have it, then that's just proof that you aren't really kind of a devout practitioner, or that kind of thing. And I didn't believe in that kind of. It seemed like it was rooted in judgment. It seemed like it was rooted in particular hierarchies, right, where we're attributing different values to different people based on their perceived abilities and that kind of thing. And I've seen a lot of exploitation, especially economically, and it just didn't sit right with me. So after being in those spaces, and it happened in an interesting way where God had told this pastor, because I'm Black, and God had told this pastor that my Black father was not in my life, which was completely false. So relying on stereotypes to try and kind of exploit and bring me in. So that was kind of the end of my Christian relationship. And I kind of tried to transition into this is a personal relationship. Maybe this is an issue of organized religion. Let me kind of do it that way. And then I kind of transitioned into my spiritual relationship as my own. I've always been spiritual. So even though I came up in a Christian household, my parents are both spiritual in particular ways, especially my father. So he believes in, you can speak things into existence, right? He believes in manifestation in that way. He believes in affirmations. He believes in spirit and those types of connections and things. So I've always also kind of been rooted in my spirituality in that way, but again, in ways where I wasn't really grounded in a specific spiritual tradition. And so kind of severed or disconnected from something meaningful, kind of using what access I did have, going into particular Wicca shops. If you folks are in Denver, ISIS, being a big one that I went to anyway. I'm trying to think of the other one that's off of Broadway, but going into those types of shops and using that as access to information, trying to find texts and things as sources of information, but keeping in mind that with the mainstream media, we only get particular images, right? We get Wicca, and it's really, again, still kind of decontextualized anyway. It's not really rooted in the origins and getting more information about the kind of the roots of the practices. So I'm kind of in this weird place where I've been wanting to, it's kind of a back and forth, wanting to connect, wanting to be grounded in a tradition, and also kind of questioning because of some of the exploitation I've seen, even in spiritual contexts. I've had folks who have weaponized, as I kind of mentioned before, weaponized their spirituality in ways where they just wanted to exploit other people, create these hierarchies where they saw themselves as kind of more enlightened and superior to other people. So, realizing I need to maybe kind of do this internally and just seek out those relationships where folks are being more mindful with their practices. So in between place, still kind of working on that relationship and trying to get more grounded, but I will go ahead and turn it over to other folks.
I can go next. So, hi. I'm Alex. You guys all know me. But hi. And so I love all these questions. They're wonderful, and they really make you think and process your spirituality, and it's wonderful. But so I am a first generation Lebanese and Syrian woman. And my mom came here when she was really little and grew up here. And so having religious freedom was a huge thing for her. And that was something that she always wanted for me. And so she decided to express her religious freedom and her spiritual freedom and all the things that she felt were really important, especially things that she got to have after coming to the United States. And so she studied every single thing in the whole world. So when I was a little kid, I was introduced to everything in the whole, just and she made sure that I studied from people who were extremely knowledgeable about these things, who were from the cultures that they stemmed from. She made sure that, and obviously, I'm sure that there are a lot of mistakes that were made. Different pagan religions are really, it's really complex. Spirituality and taking from other spiritual practices, even if you're just doing it to learn, still has there's a lot of mistakes that we could have made throughout the years. But I thought that was really special, that I kind of got to experience everything. And it was really fun. And I grew to think that spirituality was fun, and that it was something that was meant to make you happy. And it was something that was meant to be exciting and new and different. And yeah. So then I ended up really falling in love with at the time, I really didn't understand what Gardnerian Wicca was, but it was such a welcoming, beautiful community that I just got so excited. And we have this gigantic, huge plot of land that is just a giant community garden where they donate to like tons and tons of different groups of people. And all we would do is just work in the community all day and do different forms of volunteer work. And it was just a really happy, spiritual, beautiful place. And then also we took classes in witchcraft, Wiccan witchcraft, Gardnerian Wiccan witchcraft. And it was really interesting. And I learned about initiation, and I got initiated into the coven. And it was all really interesting, but I kind of stemmed away from that and just kind of, there was so much more out there and so much more to learn. And that seemed like such a small portion. And I didn't really understand the origin. It was basically just all of Europe was the origin. And that was really confusing. And so I really wanted to do my own research and go back to being a student of spirituality and not really knowing what I was doing. And so I explored a whole bunch of different things. I talked to all the members of the community that I met through the Wiccan coven, and I decided to go to different countries and study with people who were traditional spiritual leaders in different countries. I went to India. I went to Guatemala. It was really awesome. It was cool. And I just wanted to learn. And that was it. And I just wanted to see all the things that I could learn to kind of grow my spirituality, but I was still really lost and confused. I am still lost and confused. I'm still lost and confused. But I realized that a really important thing to me, which is why I'm so happy you asked this question, is why my spirituality matters to the community, why it matters to everybody on earth, and what I'm doing in the community, what I'm doing for the world, what I'm doing for the earth, what I'm doing for the planet. All of that became really important. And that is when I started trying to decide how I was going to try and give back to the community spiritually, and how I was going to connect my spirituality to the earth and to all the different things that I wanted to contribute to. And actually, that is when I came up with this. And I decided that I would find all the people who wanted to be teachers, and I would help support them and help them to spread their knowledge about everything, have students attend for free, have everything just be, I think that my way of giving back to the community spiritually is by giving everybody a place to learn. Because throughout all my spiritual teachings and journeys and all the things I tried to do, I really just thought that learning about spirituality made me feel connected. And so I wanted to share that with everybody else.
Okay, I can go next. I'm Kieran, and I'm pretty much fairly adrift at the moment in terms of spirituality. Like you, Corey, I grew up in a Christian household. Went to church pretty much every Sunday. It was somewhat relaxed, but all sorts of different ministers, and my mom was interested in learning more about other cultures, other practices, but not in terms of incorporating it into practice, just appreciating and acknowledging that there are all sorts of different practices out there. And for a while as a teenager, we actually had an Indigenous minister. So that was really interesting because he would bring a mix of, some of the Indigenous teachings, and also talk about, some of the things that he's been through, uh, and share that. So I was pretty engaged in the church. I had less of the practice because of fear, more that it was a community. And so I was sort of engaged in it as part of a community, but slowly that kind of fell away. I started finding it not fitting well, being frustrated. There's only so many times I could hear very gendered language for God before I got really frustrated. Uh, and so I ended up, ending being involved in church, but didn't really go looking for much else. At the same time, I was also a student, like I was doing graduate work in religious studies. So I was learning about a lot of different religions, different traditions, learning about different practices that exist, but never, never necessarily with an eye to being part of it. So I sort of ended in the agnostic area and didn't really do much. And so I'm now starting to go back to learning and trying to figure out what might work for me, what I might be able to connect to. I'm adopted, so don't have any genetic links really to any history or, family, things like that. And then my adoptive parents are both, from nominally Christian households, and no real sense of traditions or roots there other than that. And I live in a smaller city in Canada. Uh, not a not the easiest place to necessarily get involved in a lot of communities that are spiritual, but starting to investigate this, and so joining divination was one of the ways to learn more and get a sense of how other people do things, what practices might resonate, all of that.
Oh, me? Hi, I'm Kevin, spouse to Kieran. For the first question, based on my roots in spirituality, I don't have any. My family, my grandmother loosely believed in Christianity, and even then, she told me a lot of things to basically turn me away from the church. So I grew up basically atheistic, thinking there was a God, but he was never going to look at me. But I was much more spiritual than the rest of my family compared to my grandmother or my mom. And that didn't really go well because every time I tried to find something, I had no help. I had no connections to even who my family was, just because we have a horrible history of just being a whole bunch of bastards. And by bastards, I mean, we don't know who we're related to. So there was not even a culture that I could do that. But at the same time, I grew up and tried to go to Christianity, found it to be similar to the abuse I had gone through. That did not go well because they definitely tried to emotionally like shame you. They shame you a lot. Like the church that I went to specifically. And I couldn't take a spirituality that just wanted to tear me apart instead of build me up. So I'm still navigating what I can and cannot do. So I can't really incorporate it in my life. I try to do very minimal things, such as I do have an altar that I set up, and I try to ethically source crystals as best as I can, because I just have a thing where I don't want to tread on toes. Because I have been hurt as a person and I don't want to feed back into it. Having the wounds that I have, they're heavy. So I don't want to keep adding to that pain to other people who have been much more hurt than I have. And if I was to become more spiritual, to incorporate better in my life, to be able to have a little bit more of guideposts of where I could and could not go, so that way everyone has an equal playing field. I would just do it to better my life, to become a better person. And should someone want to learn or ask me questions like, who do I go to? I would be able to direct them to where they need to go. That's all I want to do, is make sure people are not as lost as I am, especially if they don't have any roots in spirituality in the way that other people do. That's it.
Hello, I'm Tiggy. Hello. Let's see, to answer the first question on how do I identify, I still am not 100% sure how I identify either. Our family was pretty Christian up until like the pastor at our church tried to do something to our youth coordinator, and then it was this big deal where it turned out he had tried to do something to all these women at our church, and one of them was even my own aunt. And so like it was this big thing. And so like my mom left the church for a long time, so we weren't in church. And then when I became a teenager, I got involved with something with my high school where I was like on the process to becoming like a pastor, to where you learn like every little section of the Bible. You do all these essays, you do all these like Bible studies like every other day. You do these retreats. I even got like rebaptized at 14, where my mom didn't even come. But then like almost right after that, I like felt a strong like break from that because of all these different things. Like it was not like 2 weekends after I was baptized to where our pastor was talking very anti-gay, but was not referencing it in the Bible. And I had already done a lot of training at that time, and like you're supposed to always reference something, and like there were no references, and so like I started being like really skeptical about the church I was at the time, and then I started feeling completely separated at one point to where like that was just not happening. And I started feeling a calling towards other deities, and I started having like these different dreams. Like I remember my very first dream was like at 10. One of the very first like gifts, which it's a weird story because my mom and my aunt bought me the statue of that deity that I wanted when I was 10. But when I was 16, my mom became a Jehovah Witness. And so when I was 17, my mom with the Jehovah Witnesses went through my room and like threw everything into trash bags, including that very statue that she had bought me like years before. I still have it, but like I had to re-glue it back together. And so that those experiences definitely have like influenced my, I want to say my thought processes. However, like in hindsight, like I've had to go to therapies and stuff over like the stuff that I've had to deal with. And it really feels like leaving an abusive relationship, like the parallels are very similar. It's very trippy. Like, and some of it still like affects my spell work today, because of stuff like in the back of my mind. And I'm still working through that. I do say like I am a practitioner who uses magic, but how I've got to this like identity is through different experiences, through different things I started reading, learning. When I was 14, like I said, not even that long after, I ended up meeting this lady at the park by my aunt's house, and she became a mentor to me, and eventually became like she's my grandma now. Like she's been my grandma for like 14 years. The house that I'm in, I bought from her. And so like she's my grandma, but she knew like a lot, so I learned a lot about her. Like she did every type of gemstone and like energy readings, and she didn't really have a name for her practices. She had developed them from her experiences and different people too. So like I still don't have a name for it. And then I've had a mentor for about 3 years who taught me quite a bit. And then I joined this academy a while ago to also help like learn more. When I say how do I like incorporate it into my like everyday life is I try to call like the wanted energies into everything I do. I try to I know the unwanted energies will come, but I try my best to call the wanted energies into everything I can do. Like I had heard I try to use affirmation to try to help like do things like and then like even like at work, since I work at an elementary school, some of the like brain breaks we do is like a little meditation, a kids meditation too, where they're like, I can express myself, or I can feel my emotions, or it's okay to be happy, it's okay to be sad, and so like I guess in the past I probably wouldn't have done something like that, but like now I incorporate it into something like that. And then considering my beliefs now, like at the school I work at, they still make you do the Pledge of Allegiance. And like when I first started, every single kid was still forced to like get up, even though like on the announcements, they're like, you have the right to participate or not participate, respect the decisions, but like they were still like peer pressuring the kids to like get up still. And like after I started, I'm like, I actually don't believe in that. And I see a couple kids don't want to get up. So like let's respect that. And then I even later on had to talk to someone like higher up about it because I heard like several teachers were doing it, where they're like forcing the kids to stand up and like face the flag and all this. And like they end up making announcement like every day now. It's an announcement where they're like, staff and students respect each other's decisions. And so like now I don't stand up for it. Like I don't do any of it. There's several kids who like their belief system does not want them to do that. And now like they don't want to get up. Their parents even had said something like told them like you don't have to get up, yet at school the teacher's like get up. And so now like I'm in the class, I'm like, no, you don't have to get up. If you don't want to get up for this, don't get up. And so like I do things like that to where like I feel like I incorporate it into like even my work life. And then what was my last part? I think that's all. And then my cousin, he's over here who he needs to answer. I don't know if you ever guys seen him.
Hello.
He's been in classes.
I'm over here.
Yeah.
Sorry, just don't
he hasn't made his
computer.
Zoom account yet. Okay, that's wait. Yeah.
Okay. So didn't really have a steady church to go to or any religious background like that. Growing up, bounced around quite a bit. And it wasn't until the church that my cousin was talking about that I found quite a bit of information from. But then they started with quite a few different things and ended up going to something else. And when I was younger, I had a lot of influences in my life with specific things that didn't relate to Christian or any of those different types of things. And for a while it was frowned upon. So I just kind of stopped doing that. And it wasn't until I was brought into this area and started learning about this that I actually started feeding into it more and wanted to learn more. And so here I am today. And as far as into my daily life, so I've always been drawn to crystals and to gemstones. So I work in a job where I get to find them quite often, and I like to carry them around with me. And sometimes I'll bring certain ones home, and I enjoy the way they look. I enjoy the way they feel. I like having them with me. And as far as that, I think that's just about it for me.
Thank you all for sharing with me. it's really nice to be able to connect on this level, especially because I think there are a lot of similarities and parallels in some of our experiences and things like that. And I think especially going forward, that's going to be a really interesting area, I think, to come back around to, because for me personally, and I apologize, I know that folks were kind of getting in late, so we talked about going maybe 10 minutes over, but if you folks, I want to respect your weekend as well, so we can always end at this point and kind of come back to it. But I was just going to say, it would be great to kind of talk about these types of things through the context. And that's why I bring up, the conversations about oppression and privilege. A part of what we're talking about, we're not only talking about legacies of trauma, but we're also talking about legacies of healing as well and resistance. And I think that that's really important. And I think for many of us experiencing that severing and kind of having those disconnections from our ancestors, from our own histories and our own traditions, is something that we're probably going to come back to. There was actually a book I've been meaning to share with you as well that talks all about this. So I'm going to see if I can find that and I can send that to Alex and put that on the list. But yeah, I think, doing this work in a way where I'm wanting to ground in self-care, ground in community care is really important. Creating healthier spaces, creating spaces for healing, I think is really important. So I think I would love to open up a space where we can really kind of center that in these conversations and the ways that we kind of come together. Because as I said before, there are definitely things that we can learn. There are definitely some takeaways that we can kind of take with us into our everyday lives. And I think personally, regardless of how spiritual your identity is, I think that the ways we navigate our everyday lives can be ritual or can be ritualistic. Having routine in your life where you're engaging in caring for your body in particular ways can be ritual, dedicating yourself to moving your body. And so for those of you who are interested in having those conversations, body movement is really important to working trauma out of the body because of the ways that it gets stuck and causes tension. So that is ritual, that can be spiritual. It doesn't have to be necessarily maybe rooted in some of the things that we're going to be talking about, these kind of deeper spiritual traditions, but it's kind of, it can be very validating, I know for me anyway, to recognize that I'm not the only one kind of in this position. I was thinking, maybe because this is a divination school, I'm going to come in and folks are already kind of rooted in something. They're really deeply committed to this tradition. But it's really nice to know that we're all kind of in similar situations, and it's a learning experience for everyone. And I probably said this before, I don't see myself as an expert in anything ever. I don't believe in the concept of expertise. I feel like I'm a lifelong learner, and I'm really excited to engage in this kind of learning process, and what in particular ways can feel like kind of an identity building process, or kind of like a process of becoming in particular ways, is how I like to think about it. So I would like to bring these types of things in to the ways that we're engaging in the future. Having more conversations about manifestation and maybe engaging in some of those practices, engaging in affirmation, I think is really important and beneficial. Engaging in cleansing, I would love to talk about, I think is very important and beneficial as well, especially for those traumatized folks who may be needing to work on like attachment stuff, or I know for myself personally, particular things that you want to kind of work on and focus on in cleansing work. So I'd love to bring those actual kind of tangible practices in, and opportunities to kind of engage respectfully with some of these practices when and where it's appropriate. And yeah, really, really centering, kind of thinking about like healing the split, healing the disconnect, and kind of moving forward through this process, I think is really important. And engaging in the practice with others, to me personally, feels like a way of being able to do that. But I really appreciated having an opportunity to actually be in conversation with you finally, since we didn't have a chance last time. And I do apologize for the scheduling issue. I had the worst stomach virus I've ever had in my entire life this past weekend. So I was just kind of recovering this week. But because we discovered that there was a class 4 to 6, another version of the schedule will be sent out where we kind of address and push back. I think if 6 to 8 works for folks, I'd be willing to do 6 to 8 Saturdays on the weekends where we have holidays. So But yeah, I would love to engage again in more tangible practices next time and really start getting into and playing with some of this stuff. So I'm really excited. If you ever have any particular asks of me, if there are particular traditions you really want to explore, particular practices you really want to explore, I'd like to dedicate some time to talking about libations, for example, pouring one out. So it would be really fun to engage in that kind of stuff. So whatever you have that you want to get into more deeply, don't ever hesitate to reach out. We can always connect on Facebook. I'm Rosetta Radix on Facebook because I get stalked a lot by people who don't care for the work I do. So we can connect on there as well. And don't ever hesitate to reach out. And I think my email is in the notes if I'm not mistaken. And if it is not, I will put that in there for you so you can access me there as well. But unless there's any kind of lingering thoughts that anyone has, I'd like to let you go for the evening so you can enjoy your weekend. And then again, if you have anything for me kind of before we catch up next time, don't ever hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Corey. And there's no reason to be sorry at all. I'm so happy you're feeling better. Never be sorry. You're wonderful. And thank you so much for teaching these classes. These have been so much fun. I love them so much.
Thank you for spending the time to do so. And thank you for taking a moment for yourself to make sure you're better and instead of trying to push through.
Especially at finals time. Especially at finals time. You have my sincere sympathies.
Works at university.
Yeah, I'm an instructional designer at a university and I've taught a couple of classes, so I have some of that experience.
I know you know how it is.
Yes.
It's interesting. It's yeah, it's a lot sometimes, but
yeah, we're on week
yeah.
1 of a new semester, so I'm helping a new instructor who has never taught a class in his life navigate teaching an online class.
Ouch.
Yes.
I don't pity you. If you would be interested, I actually have a course because I've been teaching online my entire career and doing both. And so I've created a class in a way where it can kind of work for both formats. So I would be willing to send you something that I have a template just to give you that kind of looks at different types of accommodations and things like that. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind sending me your email, I can send you a copy of that.
I can totally do that.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate having a chance to connect with you. I'm really looking forward to, again, being more interactive going forward. This is a lot of fun. And please always feel free to share feedback or constructive criticism with me as well. I'm always willing to kind of shift things and change things to kind of better accommodate your interests and your needs. It is your class at the end of the day. So what you want is really important. And I want to be able to center that as much as possible. And for you to kind of control the flow of our conversations and our course. So just keep me posted if there's anything at all that I can do for you all.
Thank you so much.
And I will send you the notes as well, Alex, so that I can get all of you folks the readings and everything.
Awesome. Thank you. And then, yeah, I was thinking about it. I don't know. We have a tarot card class and history class and stuff at noon. And then we have Micah's astrology class at 4. So I feel like 6 is probably the best time for Saturday. Even if it is back-to-back classes, it won't be too often anyway. So, but yeah, thank you for also being flexible about doing 6. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. And if that time works well for everyone, I can do that time. And if there's a time that works better, I'm flexible for evenings. So if we needed to do a poll, we can do that, but I can definitely do 6 to 8 if that is a good time for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. And then, yeah, I feel like 4 on Sunday, we're probably going to get a lot more people. But I also kind of like maybe that this class is smaller and the other one's bigger. So we kind of get the little small group work and then the big group work. So that's nice too.
Practice run.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then I can edit the schedule. Yeah, it's a PDF or it's a, is it a document that you send me or just a picture?
It may be a PDF, so I can go ahead and I can do that for you and I can just send another copy tonight.
Okay, thank you so much. And take your time. You can send it whenever. And I'm going to add those books to the reading list too. And that any books that you wanted to add too that you think would be beneficial for students to read off that list that you showed today would be amazing too. And I can add those to our giant reading list.
That sounds good. I can just send you the list that I have so that you have all of it.
Oh,
and
perfect.
I will make a note of which ones I've got PDFs for. And that way, if you need access, I can just send you the PDFs as well.
Oh, sweet. Awesome. Thanks. Cool. I hope you have a wonderful night. I'm glad you're feeling better.
Yes.
Thank you. I look forward to catching up with all of you next weekend. Have a good week and have a good holiday. And sending love to all of you on Mother's Day, especially if Mother's Day is a challenging day for you personally.
Oh,
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good night.
How do I stop?